I sat in the small, cramped office of our family lawyer, the smell of dust and old leather books surrounding me. It was strange, being here for something like this, to finally put the life of my father, Pastor Charles Mitchell, to rest. He'd been the pillar of our community, a respected man who'd guided our small town with a firm hand. But for me, he was just Dad, complicated, strict, and distant, but undeniably a powerful figure in my life. The lawyer cleared his throat, snapping me out of my thoughts. I wasn't alone. A few members of the church council had come out of respect, and my mom sat beside me, clutching a handkerchief, dabbing her eyes every few minutes. I sat there, feeling oddly detached. The truth was, my father and I hadn't spoken much in recent years. Our differences had created a silent rift neither of us wanted to cross. Finally, the lawyer reached the last document. "This is a letter from your father, addressed to you, David," he said, holding out a yellowed envelope with my name written in my father's familiar handwriting. My chest tightened. I hadn't expected this. A final message, something personal. I took the letter with trembling fingers, hesitating before opening it. My mother looked over at me, eyes full of curiosity and worry, but I could barely feel anything. It was like I'd been numbed. The room faded as I unfolded the letter, each word pulling me deeper into a reality I didn't want to face. "David, if you're reading this, I have left this world, but there is much you don't know, things you need to understand. I carried out God's work, not just in the church, but beyond it. There were sinners, people whose presence in this town was a stain on God's plan. It fell to me to purify, to cleanse them as He willed. They are gone now, because of me, God's servant." I stopped reading, my heart pounding. Purify? Cleanse? The words felt foreign, sinister. My father's strict sermons on sin and righteousness flashed through my mind, but this was something different. It sounded like he was confessing to crimes, maybe even murders, in the name of his warped interpretation of faith. I forced myself to keep reading, each line confirming the unthinkable. He'd written about specific people, names I recognized, people from our town who had disappeared over the years. I'd grown up hearing whispers about them, rumors that they'd just moved away or lost their way. Now, I wondered if they'd simply crossed paths with my father. "I know this may be difficult for you, David, but you must understand that what I did was for the good of our community. Sometimes, God requires sacrifices that we cannot understand. I hope you will come to see the necessity of my work, and perhaps even continue what I have begun." I felt a surge of nausea, disgusted by the cold, righteous tone of his words. Continue what I have begun. It was like a command, a twisted invitation. How could he believe I would want any part of this? I glanced around the room, wondering if everyone could hear the letter's terrible secrets echoing in my head. In that moment, the image I'd held of my father shattered, leaving a dark void where the memory of him had been. I could barely process the truth, the horror of what he'd done. But one thing was certain, I couldn't ignore this. I had to know more, understand how my father had hidden this side of himself from everyone, especially me. I folded the letter, my hands shaking as I tucked it back into the envelope. I could feel my mother's gaze on me, but I avoided her eyes. There was no way I could explain what I just read, not now. Later that night, alone in the quiet of my small apartment, I sat staring at the letter. The words burned into my mind. I knew I couldn't just let this go. If I didn't look deeper, if I didn't uncover the truth about my father's twisted actions, then who would? Taking a deep breath, I made up my mind. I'd start at his office in the church, the place he'd spent so many hours alone. Maybe there, among his books and files, I'd find answers. Answers that might finally reveal who my father really was, and what he'd done to the people who trusted him. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with the words from my father's letter. By the time dawn broke, I was already up, replaying every memory of my father, wondering how much of what I knew had been a lie. I had to go to his office at the church. If he'd left any other clues, they'd be there. When I arrived, the building was quiet, dimly lit by the morning sun filtering through the stained glass windows. The church felt eerie, empty, almost like it was hiding secrets within its walls. I moved quickly down the narrow hallway to my father's office, feeling a strange urgency. I'd been in this room countless times as a child, watching him pore over his sermons. But now, the place felt foreign. His office was exactly as he'd left it, neat and orderly. His Bible sat open on his desk, with passages marked in red ink. I hesitated, then sat in his chair, taking in every detail. This was where he'd spent his time, where he'd planned whatever he had been doing. I didn't want to imagine him here, writing out his purifications, but I knew he must have. I started sifting through the drawers, moving carefully so I wouldn't miss anything. For the most part, they were filled with typical church documents, lists of members, donation records, sermon notes. But then, in the bottom drawer, I found a small, leather-bound notebook. My father's handwriting was scrawled across the front cover, Judgments. My heart sank. I opened the notebook, dreading what I'd find inside. Page after page, he'd listed names, people from our town, families I'd known all my life. Next to each name were brief, cryptic notes, impure thoughts, unrepentant sinner, threat to community. Every line reeked of my father's harsh, rigid beliefs, his absolute conviction that he alone could pass judgment. Some of the names had dates written beside them, and it took me only a second to realize what they were, the dates of their disappearances. I swallowed hard, feeling bile rise in my throat. These people, they hadn't left town or lost their way. They'd been targeted by my father, labeled as threats, and then removed. I turned another page, and one name jumped out at me, Jacob Miller. Jacob had been my best friend when I was a kid, a quiet, gentle soul who'd gone missing when we were both 14. I remembered the day the adults told us he'd run away, the way they'd shaken their heads, as if he'd been troubled, misunderstood. But Jacob wasn't troubled. He was kind, curious, a kid who couldn't hurt a fly. Now I knew he hadn't run away. My father had marked him for purification. I felt the notebook tremble in my hands as a wave of anger and grief washed over me. How could my father have done this? And how had he kept it hidden, even from me? But the notebook didn't stop there. As I flipped further, I found references to others who understood the mission. The implication was clear. My father hadn't acted alone. There were others in the community who'd known, who had supported him. I realized then that this wasn't just a list of victims. It was a blueprint of complicity, a network of people who had helped him cover his tracks, all in the name of cleansing our town. I closed the notebook, my hands shaking. The weight of what I'd uncovered pressed down on me, a suffocating heaviness that filled the room. This wasn't just a story of my father's crimes. It was a story of a community complicit in his twisted beliefs. How many people had turned a blind eye? How many had justified his actions as necessary? Leaving his office, I felt the walls of the church closing in on me. The building that had been my family's sanctuary, now a monument to lies and betrayal. As I stepped out into the daylight, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't walk away from this. There were more answers to find, and I wouldn't stop until I had them. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to shake the horror of what I'd read in my father's notebook. Each name in that list felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, a reminder of how many lives he'd shattered. And then there were the notes about his accomplices, the people in town who had known about his twisted actions and had kept quiet, or worse, had helped him. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, I found myself unable to stay home. I needed more answers, something concrete that could make sense of my father's twisted beliefs. Returning to his office felt like a bad idea, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know the full truth. I arrived at the church just as the last of the daylight faded, casting the building in an eerie glow. The place was deserted, the hallways silent as I made my way back to his office. This time, I went straight to the bookshelf, scanning each row, hoping to find anything that could explain what had driven him to such extremes. And then I saw it, a small, worn leather journal wedged between two Bibles. I pulled it out, feeling my pulse quicken as I flipped through the pages. It was a personal journal, filled with entries that spanned years, maybe decades. Every page was filled with his careful, looping handwriting, his thoughts interspersed with verses from the Bible, as though he were justifying his every action. At first, the entries seemed harmless, typical reflections from a man of faith. But the deeper I went, the darker they became. He spoke of signs he'd seen, messages he claimed were from God, urging him to root out sin from our town. Each entry was more chilling than the last, as he described people in town with judgmental precision, pointing out their sins, their faults. It was clear he convinced himself that he was chosen for a higher purpose. Then came the entries detailing his first purification. His words were cold, clinical, as if he were describing a necessary chore rather than the end of a human life. He didn't see his victims as people. He saw them as obstacles to the community's purity, stains that he believed needed to be erased. The language he used was twisted, horrifyingly detached. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read his words. This was the real Charles Mitchell, the man beneath the pastor's collar, a man who believed he was a judge, jury, and executioner, all in the name of God. And that's when the visions began. At first, it was just a feeling like someone was watching me. I glanced around the office, half expecting to see my father standing in the corner, his eyes fixed on me with that unyielding stare he'd always had. But there was nothing there, only shadows and silence. Then, as I continued reading, I began to hear faint whispers, so quiet I thought I was imagining them. They were soft at first, just a murmur at the edge of my hearing. But as the minutes passed, the voices grew louder, filling the room with an eerie hum that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked around, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the voices continued, like the echoes of forgotten confessions trapped within these walls. I could almost make out words, snatches of sentences, voices begging for justice, for closure. It was as if the spirits of my father's victims were right there with me, reminding me of the darkness I'd uncovered. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. The voices faded, but the feeling remained. I'd gone looking for answers, and it felt like I'd found something else, something that wanted me to listen, to understand the pain and suffering that had been silenced for so long. Leaving the church, I felt the weight of my father's actions pressing down on me, the sins he'd committed casting a shadow over everything I thought I knew. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, judged, even as I stepped out into the night air. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. I knew then that this was only the beginning. The secrets I'd uncovered were too big, too dark to keep hidden. There were still answers to be found, and I was going to find them, no matter what they revealed about my father or about me. The following morning, I felt a strange resolve settle over me. I'd seen enough to know that my father hadn't acted alone. He'd written about others, people who'd supported him, shared his beliefs, and possibly helped him carry out his twisted acts of purification. I needed to confront someone who had been close to him, someone who might have the answers I couldn't find on my own. One name kept coming to mind, Elder Paulson. He was a prominent figure in our church, a close friend of my father's who had always been by his side. Growing up, I'd seen Elder Paulson and my father spend hours together after sermons, locked in discussions that no one else was privy to. I couldn't help but wonder if he'd known about my father's actions, or worse, if he'd helped. That afternoon, I headed to Elder Paulson's home. The house was small, unassuming, with an air of simplicity that matched his public persona. When he opened the door, he looked surprised to see me, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "David, my boy," he greeted me warmly, ushering me inside. "It's been too long. How are you holding up?" I sat across from him in his living room, the weight of my father's journal heavy in my bag. "I'm managing," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "I've been going through some of my father's things. There's a lot I didn't know about him." Elder Paulson's expression tightened, just for a moment, but I caught it. "Charles was a complex man," he replied carefully. "He carried many burdens for this town, more than most people will ever realize." The way he spoke, as though my father had been a martyr, filled me with anger. "Did you know?" I asked, the words escaping before I could hold them back. "Did you know what he was doing, what he thought he had to do?" Elder Paulson's face turned stony, his eyes narrowing slightly. He took a long, measured breath. "Your father was a man of conviction, David. He did what he believed was necessary. Sometimes, we are called to make sacrifices for the greater good, sacrifices that others might never understand." My heart pounded. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sacrifices? I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. People died, Elder Paulson. Families were destroyed. And you're telling me that was justified? He didn't flinch, his gaze steady and unyielding. The town needed protecting, David. Some people, they were corrupting it, leading others astray. Charles understood that, and he took it upon himself to cleanse this place. He didn't do it alone. We all knew what had to be done. A sick feeling churned in my stomach. It wasn't just my father. It was a whole network of people, a web of complicity that had wrapped itself around this town like a poison. These weren't just the delusions of one man. My father's beliefs had been shared, supported, and encouraged by people I'd grown up trusting. I could feel my hands shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. So you just looked the other way? Or did you help him? Elder Paulson's face softened, as though he pitied me. You don't understand, David. Your father's work was bigger than any one person. It was about preserving the sanctity of our community. He was doing God's work. I stood up, unable to listen to another word. God's work? Is that what you call it? You manipulated him, twisted his beliefs to fit your agenda, and now you're trying to justify it. Elder Paulson rose to his feet, his eyes sharp. You're young, David. One day, maybe you'll understand that sometimes the end does justify the means. We did what was right for the town. I couldn't listen to him any longer. I turned and walked out of his house, my mind reeling. I'd gone there for answers, but what I'd found was something far worse. A glimpse into the rot at the heart of our town, a network of people who believed they were above morality, that they had the right to decide who was worthy of redemption and who wasn't. As I walked down the empty street, I felt a heaviness settle over me. I had to make a choice. I could keep this secret buried, protect the legacy my father had left, or I could expose the truth, knowing it would shatter everything and everyone connected to him. The decision lay before me, heavy and inevitable. I just didn't know if I had the strength to make it. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. My father, Elder Paulson, the people from the notebook. It felt like they were watching me, waiting to see what I would do, as if my next step would somehow absolve or condemn them. The weight of their sins hung over me like a storm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in the middle of it. In the early hours of the morning, I got up, feeling a strange, hollow calm. I pulled my father's journal from my bag and sat at the small table in my kitchen, reading his words one last time. His sentences felt twisted, corrupted. He'd written about cleansing, about removing the wicked to protect the community. It was clear to me now that he'd lost himself in his own warped convictions, unable to separate his faith from his need for control. And yet, the journal wasn't just a confession. It was a challenge, a test. He wanted me to find it, to read it. He'd trusted that I would understand, even sympathize with him. I could almost feel his voice in my head, telling me that he'd acted out of duty, that I was the one meant to carry on his work. I wanted to hate him for it, but I couldn't. Instead, I felt a profound sadness, a sense of betrayal that was more painful than anger. This was the man I'd looked up to, the man I'd loved, and now I saw him for what he was, a man blinded by his own self-righteousness, convinced that he alone could judge right from wrong. As the sun began to rise, I made my decision. I couldn't let this stay buried, not for my father's sake, not for the town's. These people, his victims, deserve justice. And maybe, by exposing the truth, I could finally free myself from the shadow he'd cast over my life. But I knew the cost would be high. I called the sheriff's office, asking to meet him in private. The sheriff had been a friend of my father's, a loyal member of the congregation, but he was also a man of integrity. I believed he'd want the truth, no matter how much it hurt. A few hours later, I walked into his office, my hands gripping my father's journal like a lifeline. The sheriff greeted me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He could see the turmoil in my face, and for a moment, I thought he might stop me, tell me to keep the past in the past. But he didn't. "What's on your mind, David?" he asked, his voice gentle. I took a deep breath and placed the journal on his desk. It's my father's. It's a confession, Sheriff. He did things, terrible things, and there were others who knew, who helped him cover it up. He opened the journal, his eyes scanning the first few pages. I watched as his face hardened, his expression shifting from disbelief to horror. Finally, he looked up at me, his voice barely a whisper. "David, are you sure you want to go through with this? This could ruin lives. Your families, the churches, even the towns." I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "I know, but these people, they deserve justice. And if I don't do this, I'll be complicit in everything he did." The sheriff nodded slowly, closing the journal. "All right, David. We'll handle this carefully. But I need you to be prepared. Once this gets out, there's no going back. People will see your father differently. They'll see you differently too." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words sink in. "I understand," I said, my voice steady. "But this isn't about me or my family's reputation. It's about what's right." As I left his office, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I knew that the town would never look at me or my father the same way again. But for the first time, I felt free. I'd done what I had to do, broken the silence that had bound me to his legacy. Walking through the streets, I could feel eyes on me, whispers following in my wake. News would spread fast, and soon everyone would know the truth about Pastor Charles Mitchell. But I didn't look back. Whatever came next, I knew I could face it. My father's sins were no longer mine to carry. It had been weeks since I handed my father's journal to the sheriff, and the town had changed. The once quiet, respectful glances people used to give me had turned into a mix of curiosity and resentment. People avoided eye contact, some whispered when I passed, and a few, I could tell, blamed me for bringing down the man they'd admired. The news had spread faster than I expected. Reports of my father's actions, the list of victims, the complicity of others in the church. It had all shattered the image he'd worked so hard to build. Families were torn apart. Congregants left the church in waves, and the community was left reeling in the aftermath. I hadn't stepped foot in the church since then, but today something drew me back. Maybe it was the need for closure, or maybe I was just searching for a way to lay my own ghost to rest. I arrived in the late afternoon, when the light through the stained glass windows cast an eerie, multicolored glow across the empty pews. The place felt haunted, hollowed out. Every corner of the room seemed to hold memories of my father, his voice filling the sanctuary during his sermons, his eyes scanning the congregation with that stern look of judgment. Now, all that remained were echoes. I walked slowly down the aisle, my footsteps reverberating through the empty space. When I reached the pulpit, I stopped, staring at the spot where he'd stood, week after week, preaching about righteousness and sin. It felt surreal, knowing that this was the man who'd written those things, who'd believed himself to be a tool of divine justice. As I stood there, a strange feeling washed over me, a mix of sorrow and relief. I could almost feel his presence, as if he were there, watching, silently assessing me the way he always had. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of his judgment. I closed my eyes, letting the silence settle over me. I thought of the lives he'd taken, the people he'd hurt, the way he'd twisted faith into something dark and unrecognizable. And then I thought of the people who might finally find peace, now that the truth was out. When I opened my eyes, the church was just a building again, empty and unremarkable. Whatever power my father had held here was gone, dissipated with the truth. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter somehow, like I'd finally let go of a burden I'd been carrying my whole life. I turned to leave, pausing for one last look at the place that had once defined me. Then I walked out into the open air, ready to rebuild my life, free from the shadows of my father's sins.